Questions without notice. I give the call to the honourable member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the cost of living crisis is the biggest issue facing Australians today. Doug lives on the Gold Coast and his electricity bill has increased by more than 53% from last year, by $308. Electricity prices are continuing to spiral out of control under Labor, with new increases of up to 25% for households from 1 July. Why are the Prime Minister's broken promises making it harder for middle Australians?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Moncrieff for her question, and I hope that the member for Moncrieff tells Doug why she voted against energy price relief. Energy price relief. Why she voted against one of the 5 million families who will get relief on their power bills, the 1 million small businesses that will get relief on their power bills, the 111,000 households that will pay less to make their houses more energy efficient and lower their energy bills. They're just some of the measures that we've put in place. More than 1.2 million families will pay less for childcare from July 1. 11 million Australians will pay less to see a doctor as a result of our tripling of the bulk billing incentive. In the first 4 months of this year, Australians paid $76 million less for their prescriptions because of our cheaper medicines plan. And because of our budget, another 6 million Australians will pay less for their medicines, a measure that those opposite are once again saying no to. 480,000 Australians will pay absolutely nothing for TAFE, dealing with the skills crisis. 3.7 million small businesses will be able to access an expanded instant asset.
Prime Minister will pause a moment, and I'll hear from the member. Prime Minister will pause a moment. Order. The member for Casey will cease interjecting.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, it was about election broken promises. $275 reduction in power bills was promised.
Resume your seat. Order. I want to hear from the Leader of the House.
To the point of order, the question went to cost of living, it went to energy prices and it went to millions of Australians. The Prime Minister's in order.
Order. Order. Members on my right. Order. Members on my left. The member for Wannon. The question was about a number of issues. It also went to about the Prime Minister's commitments and promises, and a question around making it difficult for middle Australians. The Prime Minister is giving examples about why it is answering that part of the question. So whilst he's talking about cost of living issues, he's being relevant, and I bring him back to the question.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Well, nothing says middle Australia to me more than aged care workers. And 250,000 of them are going to get a pay increase as a direct result of this government's commitment. A commitment we took to the election, a commitment that arose from the Royal Commission into aged care, but just one of the many measures that those opposite didn't act on. We provided $11.3 billion in the budget to make sure that that was delivered. And last week, of course, again, we saw people on the minimum wage get a pay increase, something that we know those opposite are horrified by, and that during the election campaign they said the sky would fall in if people got a dollar an hour extra.
Order.
Well, we on this side of the House understand cost of living pressures which are there.
Will cease interjecting.
We on this side of the House are taking practical measures which were there in our budget, and those on that side of the House stand in the way or try to do their best to block every single positive measure that is brought before this parliament.
The call. Order. Give the call to the member for Pearce.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. What were the findings of the Australian National Audit Office report into the administration of the Community Health and Hospitals Programme? How is the Albanese Labor government acting on the recommendations of the Audit Office? Thank you.
Give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Pearce for her question. She's right. Last week, the Australian National Audit Office report into the Morrison Government's Community Health and Hospitals Fund was tabled in this parliament, the latest in a long line of scandals around programs run by the former government that breached the most basic principles of public administration. This program, Mr Speaker, allocated $2 billion of taxpayer funds to more than 170 projects. Mostly, there was no process seeking expressions of interest or making a formal assessment of the suitability of those projects. Indeed, the Audit Office found, Mr Speaker, and I quote, the Department was forced to monitor the media to know which projects had been selected. Of the 63 major projects funded, the Audit Office found that only 2 were rated as highly suitable. Only 2 out of 63. The Audit Office found that the administration of more than 100 grants under the program was, and I quote, Mr Speaker, not appropriate and involved deliberate breaches of the relevant legal instruments. One of those grants was to the now infamous Esther Foundation in Western Australia, a foundation that former Prime Minister Morrison gushed had completely captured his heart, but a foundation which has been the subject of complaints of abuse, psychological and emotional abuse, among other things, dating back to WA health authorities in 2018. This grant was ultimately approved, Mr Speaker, without a financial viability assessment, without audited financial statements or even legal authority in place to make the grant in the first place. And that wasn't the only grant that this foundation received in the lead-up to the 2019 election, of course, Mr Speaker. They also received $630,000 for security, signed off under the now Leader of the Opposition's Safer Communities Fund, which, of course, was the subject of a separate but equally scathing Audit Office report. Mr Speaker, we know on this side now more than ever every single dollar spent in health is precious, and I'm glad that my department has accepted each and every one of the Audit Office recommendations, and I've directed them to examine line by line each of the remaining projects under this program which have not yet been fully acquitted. But the stain from this long line of funding scandals, this, car park rorts, sport rorts and so many others, won't be washed so easily from the Liberal and National parties.
Give the call to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When did the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office become aware of allegations concerning sexual assault as broadcast by the project in 2021?
Give the call. Order. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Well, of course, the Leader of the Opposition asked a question about when did the Prime Minister's office know about this, and indeed that is the question. When did the Prime Minister's office know? When did the Prime Minister's office know? Because there was, of course, an inquiry into what the Prime Minister's office knew and when and who was told, and we still have never seen the Gaetjens inquiry. We still have never seen the Gaetjens inquiry.
Members on my right, the member for Reid.
We know indeed that the Leader of the Opposition asked this question, but I'm surprised because he knows that he informed the Prime Minister's office. He informed the Prime Minister's office days before.
The member for New England.
Days before there was any public announcement of
Prime
this.
Minister will pause.
Days before.
Order. The House will come to order. If someone else interjects one more time, my right, they will be removed from the chamber immediately. I want to hear from the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, it's on relevance. This is a tricky answer. The Prime Minister was asked a question. I asked, Mr Speaker, in terms of, with respect to your office, I framed it in that way, Mr Speaker. If he wants to play these silly juvenile games, the Australian...
Resume your seat. The Minister for Infrastructure will cease and The Leader of the Opposition has raised his point of order. He will cease interjecting immediately. The member for Deakin is going close to being warned. I want to hear from the Leader of the House. Order.
On the point of order, the question from the Leader of the Opposition was completely in order because it asked about the Prime Minister's office. If he wants to ask a different question to get a different answer, then page 555 of practice will tell him how to do that. But the Prime Minister is simply answering the question that is asked, and had the question been phrased. And what the Leader of the Opposition is embarrassed about is he couldn't work out how to get a question in order.
Order. Order. Members on my right. The House will come to order so I can hear from the manager.
On the point of order and responding to what the Leader of the House has said, the question from the Leader of the Opposition clearly referred to the Prime Minister. That's the Prime Minister of the day, the Prime Minister today. This man sitting here, he knows what he needs to answer, and all kinds of sneakiness and trickiness does not get around what he's supposed to be answering.
Order. I just want to deal with this matter before I return to the Prime Minister. As members know, including the manager and the Leader of the Opposition, the Prime Minister cannot be asked under standing orders, and the manager is correct on page 553 to 55 of practice, which makes clear that ministers or Prime Ministers cannot be asked questions about their actions in a former role or as a private member before becoming a minister. So the question was line ball in terms of what the Prime Minister is responsible for. Just moving forward, the questions will be ruled out of order in terms of actions or issues before ministers or Prime Ministers became into these roles. So the Prime Minister is answering the question. I'm going to listen carefully to his answer to make sure he's being relevant to the standing orders but also relevant to the question. The Leader of the Opposition, a point of order.
Mr Speaker, I thank you for your instruction to the House. I seek clarity, though, in relation to the points that you've just made. And I understand the standing orders and practice, but my clarification of you is to ask, given all of that, is it still open to the Prime Minister to answer honestly and openly the question that was put to him?
Well, the question, as I explained, was in order, line ball. I'm going to listen carefully. He's 1 minute into his answer about the issues that were raised and about the important issues, the serious issues that were raised. I'll listen to him carefully. If he strays or if he is not in line with the standing orders, he'll be brought back into order, and I'll give him the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, because I was asked about what the Prime Minister's office knew. And the truth is that goes to
the Leader of the Opposition.
That goes to the heart of what this issue is. The heart of what this issue is.
Order.
Because the heart of this issue goes to an alleged sexual assault by a Liberal staffer against another Liberal staff member in a Liberal minister's office in 2019, metres away from the then Liberal Prime Minister's office. When these allegations became public, 2 years after the Morrison government became aware of the security breach, the truth is that it sent shockwaves not just through the parliament but through the nation, as it was the first step in exposing a problematic culture in what should be Australia's safest building, the one right here. Scott Morrison had an inquiry by Phil Gaetjens, his former Chief of Staff, who was then the head of his department, a Prime Minister and Cabinet, into who knew what and when in his own office. That report has never been released. What we do know is that the Leader of the Opposition informed the Prime Minister's office prior to that information becoming public, but he didn't reveal that until 10 days after news.com.au published this information at 8 a.m. on the 15th of February, and the project aired an interview with Ms Brittany Higgins on the project that evening. For 10 days, the Leader of the Opposition said nothing about what he knew and about the fact that he informed the Prime Minister's office on that day.
Order. The member for Petrie. I want to hear from the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What will the Housing Australia Future Fund help? How will the Housing Australia Future Fund help ease the housing shortage and strengthen the economy? What is the impact of delays?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to my friend, the member for Bendigo, for her question. Mr Speaker, this government understands that one of the biggest challenges in our economy, which we are addressing, is housing supply. And that's because a shortage of homes is pushing up rents in our economy in unacceptable ways and adding to our inflation challenge. And that's why building more homes is central to our first two budgets and central to our economic plan as well. And the Housing Australia Future Fund is an important part of our efforts, and we need to see it pass through the Senate as soon as we can. Now, the Housing Australia Future Fund is a $10 billion fund to build 30,000 social and affordable homes in the first 5 years. It's part of our broad and ambitious housing policy over the course of two budgets. In October, we had a National Housing Accord, as well as another $575 million under the NIFIC to unlock an additional 5,500 new dwellings. In the May budget, Mr Speaker, we had new tax breaks to increase the supply of rental homes built to rent. We had an increase to the NIFIC cap by $2 billion to support the construction of more homes. We had increased eligibility for the first home guarantee and the regional first home buyer guarantee as well. And we had extra funding for the states and territories via the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, in addition to the biggest increase in Commonwealth rent assistance in around 3 decades, Mr Speaker. So the Housing Australia Future Fund is not the only part of our housing policy, but it's absolutely an important part of our housing policy. And so much of what we are doing addresses or responds to consideration of issues raised with us in good faith in the course of recent weeks and months, and I pay tribute to the Housing Minister for her work with crossbench colleagues. Now, Mr Speaker, we have low expectations of those opposite. They made a mess of housing and now they refuse to help clean it up. That's standard across the economy. But we need better here from the Greens. It's time to end the ambit claims and political games being played on housing in the Senate. I say to the Greens, don't put the politics of product differentiation ahead of a policy outcome which would make a difference to the lives of the most vulnerable people in our country. Don't do in the Senate what you do in your electorates, which is to give speeches about social housing but then oppose it when it really counts. Mr Speaker, if the Greens want more social housing, then voting against a $10 billion housing fund is a pretty bizarre way to go about it. I say to the Greens, Mr Speaker, and I say to the Senate, to everyone in the Senate, if you want more social and affordable housing, it's time to actually vote for it.
Before I call the member for Mayo, order. As members would know, this week the meeting of the Australian Local Government Association will be gathering in Canberra, and I'm pleased to inform the House, and as I will be doing each day, that present in the gallery today are representatives from the Victorian and Queensland Shire Councils, and we warmly welcome you to Parliament. Give the call to the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. I support consumer access to cheaper medicines. However, many of my Mayo pharmacists are genuinely worried that the 60-day dispensing without adequate compensation will leave them to lay off staff, reduce services or close. I ask the Minister, what modelling has been done on the impacts on regional pharmacies, and will the Minister assure the House that no pharmacy will be forced to lay off staff or close as a result?
Give a call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Mayo for her question and for her engagement over a number of discussions about the impact of this policy on community pharmacies in her electorate in the Adelaide Hills and a bit beyond that, but also on her constituents. We went to the last election promising cheaper medicines, and we're very proud of the record of delivery we already have on making that happen in 12 short months. but we recognise there is more to do, which is why, unashamedly, we accepted the advice of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee in the budget to move to a 60-day dispensing limit for certain common medicines that are used for chronic disease. This is a common practice around the world and recognises the changing nature of patient profiles. 30-day dispensing makes eminent sense in a patient profile which sees people get single bouts of infectious disease, a single dispensing of a prescription, and then they're better. It doesn't make as much sense when people are on the same medicines for years or even decades. Now, most obviously, this is going to be good for the hip pocket of patients, 6 million patients across the country. It's also going to be very good for their health, because we know in evidence overseas, in other countries that have adopted this, the most likely time people go off their medicines is script renewal time. So in those jurisdictions that have adopted 60 or even 90-day dispensing, medicine compliance lifts by around 20%. That's why this is supported by doctors' groups, by patient groups and by other groups, including in rural...
The Minister will pause and I'll hear from the Leader of the Nationals.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, the question was very specific about modelling, and did the Minister undertake any modelling? He's doing everything he can to answer to do anything but...
Order. Resume your seat. The Leader of the Nationals is warned. You raise a point of order. You do not continue with your argument. If you interject one more time, you'll be removed from the chamber. It's highly disorderly. The Minister for Cybersecurity is getting close to being warned as well. The question was about cheaper medicines, about pharmacies and modelling and the impacts. I'm going to give the Minister the opportunity to conclude his answer.
Thank you, Speaker. And in addition to the hip pocket benefits, the health benefits, the freeing up of millions of GP consults, there's also the improved convenience for people who live in rural communities. I mean, I live within about 100 metres of a pharmacy. People who live in rural Australia have to travel vast distance to reach their pharmacy, which is why this measure has been supported by the College of Rural and Remote Medicine, by the Rural Doctors Association and by the National Rural Health Alliance. Now to the last part of the member's question, of course we are committed to the viability of the community pharmacy sector, which is why we've committed to fully reinvesting all of the savings that we make here. And the most substantial focus of us in designing that reinvestment package is on the impact particularly of small rural pharmacies. And we've had a couple of good discussions, the member for Mayo and I. We are doubling the rural maintenance allowance, which is essentially a payment that rural pharmacies receive simply to stay open. That will have differential impacts depending on which part of rural Australia they live in. To the member for Maranoa, for example, there are areas where pharmacies will receive an increase from $40,000 in their allowance to $90,000, a 120% increase in the payments they receive simply to remain open. We're still consulting about the final design of the package, and I look forward to further discussion.
Concluded. The Minister's time is concluded. The member for Gippsland on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to move an extension of time to allow the Minister to actually talk about the modelling as well.
The Minister's concluded his answer. You need to do that while he's speaking. Order. The House members on my right. This level of interjection continues. There will be a general warning issued. People warned so far are the Leader of the Nationals. We're going to hear from the next question, and that's from the member for Hawke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What are the Albanese Labor government's plans for economic growth and security, and to ensure Australia is well placed to seize the opportunities in front of us?
To call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Hawke for his question, and I spoke to CEDA today, which was a conference being held here at Parliament House talking about the challenges that are there in the global economy and about Australia's opportunity to seize the advantages that we have going forward. We know that international inflation is causing major pressure on households, including here in Australia, and indeed of all of the Anglo countries. Indeed, interest rates are higher in the UK, the US, New Zealand and Canada, for example, than they are here in Australia. But we know that people are under real pressure. So the task of government is to look after those Australians who are doing it tough, but also to help people, under pressure here and now, but also to not take our eye off the future, how we take advantage of the opportunities which are there before Australia. And indeed, the opportunities that are there, that we need to break new ground. We need to attract new sources of international investment. We need to diversify our future exports, and the government's been working on that with countries like India and Indonesia and other agreements that have been put in place. We need to boost the skills of our workforce. That's why we have Fee-Free TAFE making a difference, 20,000 additional university places. We need to build greater resilience in our supply chains, because we know that the Reserve Bank Governor has identified that as the big pressure which is there. We need to move more of our businesses up the international value chain, and that's what the National Reconstruction Fund is about, helping existing industries to boost their productivity, to boost their investment, but also the creation of new industries, particularly those that will benefit from the clean energy transformation that is occurring. We need also to support the full, equal, respectful and overdue participation of women in the economy. And one of the things that childcare is about is boosting participation but also boosting productivity. We are seeing some positive results. The most jobs created in the first year of any government in Australian history. Record levels of participation, including a record number of women in full-time work. And wages growing at the fastest rate in a decade, with real wages growth forecast for next year. We're proud of those achievements, but we're certainly not resting on it, because we know that after a wasted decade there is not a day to waste. We need to seize the opportunities which are there. My government is determined to do just that.
Call to the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, has Senator Gallagher misled the Senate?
Give a call to the Prime Minister.
No.
Give a call. Order. Give a call. Order. Give a call to the member for Holt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness. How will the Housing Australia Future Fund's guarantee funding stream complement the Albanese Labor government's ambitious housing agenda, and what is standing in the way?
Give a call to the Minister for Housing, Minister for Homelessness and the Minister for Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do want to thank the member for Holt for that important question. I know that she is very concerned about her constituents dealing with housing challenges in her electorate, and of course those in this place that are taking seriously the housing challenges right across the country, whether it be for renters, for buyers or for those trying to find a safe, affordable place to call home. Indeed, we did inherit significant housing challenges after little action from those opposite, Mr Speaker, and we've been working incredibly hard to try and turn that around.
A moment. The member for Deakin is now warned. So that means if you interject one more time while the minister is speaking, you'll be removed from the chamber. I'll give the minister the call.
Speaker, we are trying to turn this around, but it will take coordinated action and indeed significant investments. And our ambitious housing agenda is ambitious because it needs to be. And we're investing more than $8 billion in the coming year on housing and homelessness services, Mr Speaker. It's why we unlocked $575 million immediately to help social and affordable rental housing get on the ground, and we have homes under construction today right across the country, including some homes in my home state that will be taking tenants in coming weeks, Mr Speaker, coming weeks. And that's why we're working with state and territory governments to deliver tens of thousands new rental homes through the Housing Accord and, of course, the $1.7 billion through the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement for the coming year. Our budget, as you've heard from the Treasurer, did make changes to build to rent and, of course, the $2 billion in financing for more social and affordable rental homes and the largest boost to Commonwealth rental assistance in more than 30 years. We've also helped more than 50,000 Australians into home ownership over the past 12 months. We're working right across the housing spectrum, Mr Speaker. The member for Holt also asked whether the Housing Australia Future Fund could be relied upon to provide predictable and perpetual stream of funding that this country needs for housing. And indeed it can, Mr Speaker. All of the experts agree that one of the best ways to provide certainty for ongoing Commonwealth investment is for an establishment of a dedicated future fund, like the Medical Research Fund, like drought relief. Social housing is just the same. But it's not just the experts who support this, Mr Speaker. Of course, those opposite did exactly this when they were in office. Indeed, most of the future funds were under the Liberal government. But they're not the only ones, Mr Speaker, that support future funds. Back in 2012, the now leader of the Greens party moved in the House to establish a future fund. And he said, Mr Speaker, and I want to quote, "I do believe the future fund has shown that it is possible for such a fund to function effectively and with fairly wide support in Australia," Mr Speaker. And I agree with him, Mr Speaker. I do agree. A future fund is a good idea to fund important social infrastructure like housing. But, Mr Speaker, sadly this has become all about the politics, and it shouldn't be. This is not an opportunity for door-knocking. It's not an opportunity for campaigning. It's about people on the ground, people that need homes the most. And we're going to continue to stand up for people that need the homes, and the Senate should support the bill.
Barker. Order. Members on my right. The member for Spence will cease interjecting. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Minister for the Environment. I refer the Minister to her recent interviews on Channel 7's Sunrise. Was the Minister or her office aware, prior to the 15th of February 2021, of the allegations aired on the project that night?
Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Oh. Okay. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order. The Leader of the House is seeking the call. Order. Order. Members on my left, I want to hear from the Leader of the House.
I refer to page 554 and 555 of practice, where there are a number of occasions, and we've been through this a lot over the years, and there are many precedents under Speaker Smith, where if a question is asked about someone that goes to a period prior to them holding the portfolio, the first question that can only be asked is to refer to the quotation where, as a minister, they have reference back to it, and to ask whether that is correct. And that simply referring to it and then asking a different question, certainly our whole time in opposition, that never got it over the line. The first question, always had to be providing the quotation exactly in line with that precedent, asking whether that was accurate, and then subsequent questions could come based on the answer the minister had then given. And that's the way it's worked here the whole way through.
Order. Order. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, practice is very clear at page 555. Where ministers have made statements either inside or outside the House that may concern their actions before becoming a member and or a minister, questions have been permitted on those statements. The question was very specifically in relation to quite extensive statements the minister who's received the question made about this matter on Sunrise on Monday and indeed prior to that.
Order. The member for McEwen will not interject. I just want to be clear on this point of practice because, order, the questions of this nature are problematic because, as members know, standing orders are clear that ministers can only be asked about questions about which they are currently responsible for. Whilst the Deputy Leader did frame the question around media statements and comments that were made, I want to be clear, and the Minister has indicated she's happy to take the question, moving forward, that members can only ask questions about issues surrounding the statement around page 55, where ministers have made statements either inside or out the House about matters that may concern their actions before becoming a member and a minister, that questions have been permitted on these statements twice. I'm just going to allow the minister to be careful with her answer to make sure she's conforming with the standing orders, but also in making it relevant to the question regarding her statement, not anything before she was a minister, but regarding her statements as a minister. I'll give her the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I 100% stand by what I said on Monday, and I 100% stand by what I have done at every stage. And I tell you what really shocks me about this, and what really disappoints me, is that once again we are missing the point here. A young woman who worked in this place has made a serious allegation that she was sexually assaulted in her workplace. She's made serious allegations that was not properly investigated or dealt with.
The Minister will pause. The member for Newcastle, the Deputy Leader, on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the question was within the standing orders. The Minister indicated her willingness to answer the question. The point of order now is on relevance. The direct question was the Minister or her office aware prior to the 15th of February 2021 of the allegations aired on the project that night? So if she's answering the question, she needs to answer the question.
The Deputy Leader will resume her seat. I just wanted, for clarity for the Deputy Leader, if that was the question, it would have been ruled out of order. So, no, just moving forward, because you're asking a question about a decision or an action that took before she became a minister. Your question was framed around her media interview. That's why it was permitted under the standing orders. You can only ask ministers or the Prime Minister questions about what they've been responsible since they've become Prime Minister or a minister. So the minister is being relevant. I'm going to listen carefully to what she says to make sure she is in with standing orders. So far she is. I'll give her the call. She has 1 minute remaining. 2 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition asked me if I stand by what I said on Monday, and I do. And I'll tell you why I do. Because it shocks me that in this place today we've got these sorts of questions when what the issue is here is a young woman who worked in this place has made a serious
allegation. The Attorney General will cease objecting.
That she complains and has further alleged that her complaint was not dealt with appropriately by her employer. You bet I asked questions. You bet I took it seriously. Would I do the same again? I 100% would. There is a reason, Mr Deputy Speaker, that only 13% of sexual assaults are reported to police in this country.
The Minister will pause. The member for North Sydney on a point of order.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's just on Standing Order number 91, which is about disorderly conduct. This is a conversation which is highly emotive, and there are questions to be answered here, but I do not think it's appropriate for any member of this House to be yelling across the chamber at another member to just simply shut up. I don't think that's appropriate. So if I could call the House back to order and ask that that be addressed.
Order. Has the Minister concluded her answer? Just to the member for Lawler is on her feet. The member for Lawler will resume her seat for a moment. The House will come to order. I agree there is far too much noise, particularly regarding this subject. So I'm going to ask all members to just reflect on that point, and I will hear from the Deputy Leader on a point of order.
Your ruling, Mr Speaker. The Minister's non-answer to the question relates to your ruling, I suggest, and I want to ask to your ruling and quote from practice, where ministers have made statements either inside or outside the House about matters that may concern their actions before becoming a minister, questions have been permitted on those statements. I'm not sure what in your ruling narrows the answer that the minister was entitled to give so that she actually could not address the question that I was asking her.
Order. The Minister for Infrastructure. I'll hear from the Leader. The Minister has concluded her answer, but I'll hear from the Leader of the House on this matter.
Thanks. Just to the point of order, Mr Speaker, because there's no doubt this issue will arise again on other times. It has over the last 10 years. The key point is the final two words that were just read out by the Deputy Leader, which is about questions having been permitted on those statements. The question can only be asked about the statement that has been made while the person was a minister.
So just so everyone is clear, if there are going to be further questions, order, the practice is just to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and I'm happy to go through with this through her after question time if that assists as well. Questions can be asked of a minister. That point of practice is about statements that they've made as a minister regarding another issue. So whatever the minister may or may have said on that interview, you can ask questions about. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, Mr Speaker, just to be clear on this point, what the minister said in her interview on Monday went specifically to the question of who had known what prior to the episode being broadcast. So I'd suggest to you that the Deputy Leader is entirely within the standing orders in the question she's asked.
Well, that's why it was allowed. That's correct. If it wasn't, it wouldn't have been allowed. We'll move forward and give the call to the member for Lawler.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Government Services. In light of the serious findings of the Watt Review, what information can the Minister provide about procurement investigations and tainted contracts?
Give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
Thank you. The findings of Dr Watt's review of procurement practices under the previous coalition government are extremely troubling. The review examined 95 contracts awarded to de facto Canberra lobbying firm Synergy 360 clients, and it identified irregularities in 19 of those 95 contracts. In other words, about 1 in 5 of the contracts were found to be questionable. As we know, a common ingredient in this was the former member for Fadden, Stuart Robert. Just last week, in a critical report from the Auditor-General, Stuart Robert's name again popped up, this time in relation to a procurement for the Permissions Capability System. For the benefit of the House, on the 17th of October 2020, Home Affairs commenced a new procurement process for the broader Permissions Capability System that was to extend beyond visas to citizenship, customs functions and personnel security clearances. The announcement was via a joint media release issued by the then Acting Minister for Immigration, Alan Tudge, and NDIS Government Services Minister Stuart Robert. However, at this time, Stuart Robert appears to have had no official responsibility, portfolio or otherwise related to the project, but he's on the press release. Then, on 15th of April 2021, EXCO signed off on the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison's transfer of responsibility of the Digital Transformation Agency from Minister Linda Reynolds to, guess who? Minister Stuart Robert. Then, on the 13th of July 2001, Stuart Robert met with Accenture. They were subsequently awarded a contract that the ANOA states would have cost $111 million. The Auditor-General has found that Stuart Robert's meeting with Accenture was contrary to probity plan and protocols. I repeat that at page 44. The Minister held a meeting with personnel from the preferred tenderer before the commencement of contract negotiations. Contrary to probity plan and protocols, the meeting was not recorded on the probity registrar. The latest troubling revelation is relevant to Australians and an upcoming Public Audits Committee on June the 23rd for several unanswered questions. 1. Did Mr Robert have a series of undisclosed or poorly disclosed relationships with private interests seeking to make profit from taxpayer dollars? 2. Did Mr Robert's associates seek to monetise Mr Robert opening doors, providing privileged, commercially advantageous insights and access? 3. Did Mr Robert's associates have a scheme to digitise government services worth billions of dollars, starting with Home Affairs, then across the government, with Mr Robert as their special friend inside government? 4. Do Mr Robert's former colleagues, now silent in the House, endorse his actions and conduct? And 5. Why do 114,000 Gold Coast voters have to go to an unnecessary by-election on July the 15th merely because Mr Robert was feeling the heat in the kitchen at long last?
Give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for the Environment. In the last parliament, the member asked 16 questions in question time relating to the serious allegations aired on the project. When asked about this questioning on Sunrise on the 5th of June this year, the minister stated that nobody tells me what to ask in question time. Did the minister engage with any third parties regarding the content of these questions before she asked them?
Order. Order. We'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Just in terms of the earlier ruling and practice, Mr Speaker, the final tag of the question has to be about the statement, not about taking it somewhere else. You can't refer to the statement and say, having done that, now I'm going to ask about this. The question has to be about what was said in the statement, because the statement is what was said as a minister.
I'll hear from order. I'll hear from the manager. From the manager.
Mr Speaker, the question very specifically went to what the minister said in her interview on 5 June this year, describing her practices in relation to question time.
That part of the question is in order. The last part, or the hook, that the Deputy Leader was adding into that regarding another subsequent question, I just want to remind all members, practice allows questions only to what the minister has said as a minister. She is entitled to answer that question. I'll listen to her carefully to make sure she's relevant to that part of the question, the Deputy Leader.
Speaker, I submit to your ruling that there is one question that I have asked that relates to one statement that the minister made in a media interview, and my question directly relates to that statement. And with respect to your comment that there's a hook of some alternative question, it is simply not present. It is a straightforward question about, I don't take instructions about questions I ask, whether she had any engagement with any third parties about the content of those questions. And I submit that they are not two questions, Prime Minister.
Order. Just going to ask, just call the minister to the dispatch box. She can answer the question. I'm going to listen carefully to make sure she's being relevant to the question and to standing orders.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I say again, nobody tells me what to ask in question time. But is it any surprise that the Shadow Minister for Women, when she hears in the media that there has been a sexual assault in Parliament House, a very serious allegation, and then also hears in the media that that has been inappropriately dealt with by the employers in this place, that she would ask questions? Is there any wonder? And in fact, Mr Speaker, I would say I would not have been doing my job at all if I had not asked questions about this.
Order.
And Mr Speaker, can I take us back to the issue at hand here once again? Is it any wonder, Mr Speaker, that only 13% of sexual assaults in this country are reported to police when we see what has been happening in the media this week, with SMS messages leaked to the media,
Order.
with private conversations taped and leaked to the media?
I'll just deal. The minister will report. Order. I'll hear from the member for Goldstein, who was on her feet first. The member for Goldstein, a point of order.
Mr Speaker, section 91, disorderly conduct. I would remind the chamber how triggering this conversation is for the woman involved, the staff in this building and the women around Australia who are victims of sexual assault, and also remind the chamber that we have young people in the gallery listening to this behaviour.
Look, I want to remind all members that we have a role to play and set the standard for an inclusive, respectful and professional workplace here in Australia and across Australia. Order. I want to ensure that we display exemplary individual leadership as we've agreed by all members of this parliament in February this year. I'll hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
It's on relevance, Mr Speaker, and the points that the member for Goldstein raised around the content of the conversation would be respected better by the minister if she simply answered the question.
Resume your seat. Resume your seat. Order. The minister is being relevant because the question was about her statement, which She is answering about these issues. She has the call. She's halfway through her answer. She's going to be heard in silence. She has the call.
Mr Speaker, I want to thank the member for Goldstein for bringing us back to what matters here. This conversation is an incredibly difficult conversation for many thousands of people who are watching this right now. They find it distressing because they know that when victims of sexual assault report these matters to the police, they often go into a process which is re-victimising and re-traumatising. In every instance, Mr Speaker, I behaved ethically and completely properly, respectful of the issues at hand and respectful of the people involved.
The member for New England will cease interjecting. Give the call to the member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veteran Affairs. What steps is the Albanese Labor government taking to combat veteran homelessness?
Give the call to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Minister for Defence Personnel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I would like to thank the member for Tangney for this important question and thank him for the work that he's doing with his veterans in his community. I know that he has visited with organisations in his electorate that are looking to provide homelessness services to support veterans in Western Australia, which is really important. And we learned how important it is in March when the census data was released that showed that on census night in 2021, 1,555 individuals who have served our nation were homeless. And in the first 12 months of this Albanese Labor government, we've been working to deliver on our commitments to build a stronger foundation for a better future for veterans and families. And that includes doing things like in the October budget that we handed down, $3.6 million for the Scott Palmer Centre in Darwin, which will provide homelessness services for veterans in Darwin and is very important. But I want to draw members' attention to the report that was handed down in May of this year, Housing All Australians, Leaving No Veterans Behind, because they said Australia is in a housing crisis. We don't have enough social, affordable and public housing for the people who need it most, including our veterans and other key workers. This has long-term implications for Australian society as we know it today. Doing nothing is not an option. And that report made a key recommendation. Alongside the investment required by governments to address the lack of public, social and affordable housing supply, investment in outreach services and the development of more targeted and intensive care programs that provide comprehensive and ongoing support could be considered. Well, Mr Speaker, I'm very proud to be part of a government that wants to do exactly that. Because part of our commitment at the last election, as part of the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, the legislation for which we are trying to get through this parliament right now, was that $30 million would be allocated to build housing and fund specialist support services for veterans experiencing homelessness. And after a wasted decade, we are now running out of time. RSL Australia says the time for action is now. VASI RSL Care says we urge the parliament to come together and reach agreement. I met with the RAFA Association in WA only yesterday about this important issue. They would like to be able to fund services in a state which currently has no specialist veteran homelessness service, and yet we can't do that, not because we don't want to. We can't do it because the Liberal Party and the National Party and the Greens Party are saying no. They are saying no to funding veterans' homelessness services, and they can shout about it all they like, Mr Speaker, but the reality is it is those parties that are holding up providing these services desperately needed right now.
The Minister's time has concluded. Order. Members on my left. Give the call to the member for Warringah.
Thank you. To the Attorney-General, media publication of leaked private material produced for a police investigation undermines trust and confidence in the criminal justice system for victims. Both the Privacy Act Review and the Australian Law Reform Commission have each recommended strengthening the privacy standards that media organisations should consider prior to publication. What steps is the government taking to review the exception to the Privacy Act for journalism, as journalists have an inadequate, self-regulated code of ethics and Australia does not have a statutory tort for the breach of privacy?
Give a call to the Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for Warringah for raising some very important questions, particularly her question concerning the Privacy Act review. The review made a range of recommendations for law reform, as did the Australian Law Reform Commission. Both of those have been subject to a further consultation process, and the government is now considering all of that. As Attorney-General, I am deeply concerned about the apparent unauthorised publication of material produced as a result of a subpoena in the criminal trial of Mr Bruce Lerman. Material produced to a court in response to a subpoena is subject to an implied undertaking from the parties who receive it that it won't be used for purposes other than for those court proceedings. It's a rule known as the Harmon Rule or the Harmon Undertaking. To breach it may constitute a contempt of court. I do understand that the Australian Federal Police have received a complaint in respect of this matter and that the AFP is currently assessing that complaint. In terms of my own portfolio, I'd say this. It's vital that victims of alleged sexual assault have confidence that if they come forward and report what happened to them, they will be treated fairly by our justice system. And I would add, all who come forward are entitled to be treated with complete respect by everyone. We know that rates of reporting sexual assault are low and conviction rates are even lower. Many victims are deterred from ever talking about what happened to them, which means perpetrators are more likely to escape responsibility. It's an issue that the Albanese government takes extremely seriously. In the most recent budget, we announced $6.5 million for measures in my portfolio to strengthen responses to sexual violence. It'll include an Australian Law Reform Commission inquiry into justice responses to sexual violence with a focus on law reform proposals to strengthen sexual assault laws and improve experiences of victims and survivors in the justice system. It'll include a ministerial-level national roundtable on addressing sexual assault, which will bring together victims, survivors and relevant services and advocates and state and territory ministers. It's in addition to other work which is underway in the Standing Council of Attorneys General with the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. We all have a responsibility, those of us in this parliament and in the media, to discuss this issue in a careful and responsible way which properly respects the interests of victims.
Call to the member for Wills.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government ensuring defence spending will be invested in the critical capabilities the ADF needs? And how does this compare to what was inherited?
Give the call. Order. Give the call to the Minister for Defence and the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for his question and acknowledge his contribution to Australia's national security. During the course of the last 12 months, the Albanese government has been making generational decisions in defence, establishing the pathway by which Australia will acquire a nuclear-powered submarine capability and retasking the Australian Defence Force for the first time in 35 years. And underpinning this have been difficult but real funding decisions, which have seen $7.8 billion of spending be reprioritised over the course of the next 4 years, and a growth in the defence budget of 0.2% of GDP above what we inherited from those opposite over the course of the next decade. Now, these decisions have been hard, they have been painful, they have apparently been opposed by those opposite, but the outcome has been that spending is now focused on where defence needs it the most. And this is a process which is wholly unfamiliar to those opposite, because when those opposite were in government and faced with a problem in defence, their solution was to make an announcement without any money behind it. $42 billion of unfunded defence announcements, which put an intense pressure on the Department of Defence, who were effectively asked to engage in planning around eventualities for which there were no dollars. But over the course of the last 2 months, with the Defence Strategic Review and affirmed just 2 weeks ago at Senate estimates, we've also learnt that the former government regarded the defence budget as their piggy bank, a piggy bank that they were very happy to raid, with the effective outcome of a significant cut in defence spending, cuts that were very deep indeed. In their last 5 years in government, we saw $20 billion of effective cuts from the defence budget, the bulk of which occurred through a strategic reserve adjustment worth billions of dollars. So, on the one hand, they were making announcements without any funding behind them, while on the other they were ripping tens of billions of dollars out of the defence budget, and none of that adds up. Well, Mr Speaker, thankfully all of that is in the past. None of this can be undone overnight, but during the course of the last year, we have started to get the defence budget back into order. We have sharpened defence spending. We have reprioritised it so that we will see a much greater quality of outcome in the defence spend, and we will grow the defence budget over the course of the next decade. And this is hard, but the moment requires nothing less, because the Albanese government is committed to—
Order. Here from the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. In the gallery today are Glendon Watts and Bill Boland and many other farmers from Mallee who will be impacted by the government's fast-tracking 28,000 kilometres of poles and wires across regional Australia. How many more farmers like Glendon and Bill will be impacted from Labor's arrogant policy to steamroll local communities in pushing forward 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines?
The call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Order. The Minister for Climate Change has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question, but say to her and the House it would have been better if that question was more anchored in the facts. And the facts are the matter. The fact that—
Order. Members on my left. The member for Gippsland. The minister will continue with his answer and be heard in silence, otherwise people will leave the chamber.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The honourable member made a number of assertions in her question, and it is appropriate to point out that those assertions are incorrect. Now, in relation to VNI West, I'll say this. The number of farms affected will depend in no small part on the final route selected. AEMO made an announcement 2 weeks ago, that they had changed the proposed route based on community feedback. Mr Speaker, that is no bad thing. That is no bad thing.
Order.
The new option 5A pivots away from its original path, heading north-west instead of through Charlton and the Board Irrigation District to skirt around Kerrang and hit the Murray River downstream of Barmah. Now, this is a result of community consultation. Community consultation is something we take very seriously in the government, Mr Speaker. In fact, the last sitting week, I met with the Murray River group of councils who came to talk to me about the route, and I accepted the meeting request, of course, Mr Speaker. They asked to speak to me about it. They said to me that they appreciated the consultation that AEMO and the federal government had engaged on. They appreciated the engagement with the government. They made that point to me, Mr Speaker. They requested a meeting and they got one.
The minister will pause. Order. The member for Mallee is entitled to be heard in silence with her point of order.
Point of order, relevance. I asked how many other farmers will be impacted like Glendon and Bill with their farms.
And the minister is being relevant by explaining the process. So I'm listening carefully to his answer. He has only been going for about half his answer, and I'm listening carefully to make sure he's relevant. He is being relevant to the question, and he has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I was saying, I met with those mayors in the impacted area. They made clear to me their support for the project. In fact, they announced, in response to the government's announcement of rewiring the nation, they said with local supply chain investment estimated to be in excess of $1 billion and more than 3,000 jobs in the construction phase, this investment will deliver stimulus effects, long-term economic social benefits. Why don't you care what the mayors say? They gave me, I'm wearing this lapel badge, Mr Speaker, which they gave me, and they thanked me for the engagement of the federal government. Now,
Order.
I'll tell you what.
The minister will pause. Members on my right. The member for Fairfax is warned. The Leader of the Nationals is on a warning. The minister in continuation and will be heard in silence.
Now, thank you, Mr Speaker. And I say to the honourable member, if she wants to meet with me to talk about these issues, she's welcome to, as other honourable members have, as the member for Eden Monaro regularly has, on similar matters in her electorate. That is what good representatives do, seek a meeting with the minister, talk the issues through. But we'll talk about the facts, Mr Speaker. We'll talk about the facts, Mr Speaker. And the fact of the matter is that this V&I West link has been discussed for many years. Now, we are getting on with the job, but we are, to be fair, the first government to focus on this issue. The previous government also focused on the issue. In fact, my predecessor, the then Minister for Energy, said we are investing in the V&I West because it is expected to generate $1.9 billion in net market benefits. That's what the member for Hume, my predecessor, said about this project. He was backing it in, saying how important it is. Now, Mr Speaker, this is an important project. It will be delivered properly by this government.
Concluded. Give the call to the member for Boothby.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Aged Care. How has the Albanese Labor government addressed the crisis it inherited in aged care, and what is the government doing to build a more equitable and sustainable future that puts older people at its centre?
Call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
I thank the member for Boothby for her question, and I know for her passion and commitment to lifting the standard of care for older Australians in Boothby. The Albanese government inherited an aged care system on the brink. We had to act with urgency, and that is exactly what we've done. Today, as we speak, we have more than 100 urgent reform projects on the go to deal with the extent of the crisis that we inherited. And in our first 12 months, we have addressed 69 recommendations of the Royal Commission. That's almost half. We've legislated new standards for increased care minutes and for 24/7 nursing to improve care. We've introduced a star rating system to provide more transparency and to help older people make more informed decisions about their care. We've capped fees in home care to stop the rorting. We've committed $11.3 billion to lift the wages of our dedicated workers to help build and retain the workforce needed to care for our ageing population. And we've committed to building an aged care system where older people are at the epicentre. It's why we are drafting a new Aged Care Act that focuses on the rights of older people. This new Act will address another 24 recommendations of the Royal Commission. It's why we'll deliver a new support-at-home system that helps people age at home for longer, and that will address another 21 recommendations of the Royal Commission. And it's why last week I announced the members of the Aged Care Task Force, who will look at how we set the aged care sector up to succeed, equipped to face the future. 15 Australians with experience and expertise in economics, in finance, in public policy, in ageing and in aged care. The task force features First Nations people, consumers, providers and workforce advocates. The task force seeks to answer the unanswered questions from the Royal Commission: how to create an equitable and sustainable sector. The task force will help the Albanese Labor government's seismic shift in aged care, from provider-focused to person-focused, and from funding-focused to care-focused. And we are already seeing renewed optimism. Pat is a retired aged care worker, and following the Press Club address last week, she contacted me to say that after working in aged care for 45 years, this is the most hopeful she has ever felt about aged care.
Wow,
and this government recognises both Pat and Pat's service and the scale of the challenges that we inherited. And there is no doubt in my mind that every day we draw heat, or I draw heat, from those opposite just for striving for a higher standard of care for older Australians is a day in office better spent than one tinkering around the margins, merely striving to avoid scrutiny in the first place. Because, Mr Speaker, that is exactly how those opposites spent their time in office, thinking about aged care. The Royal Commission recognised that, and we won't repeat their shameful legacy.
The Minister's time has concluded. Give the call to the member for Kennedy.
Health Minister, your pharmaceutical initiative, your VER, halves prescription costs. It also halves pharmacists' incomes. Destroying owner-operator pharmacies creates a chemist warehouse, Terry White duopoly, already 40% of market share. Careful, Minister. Isn't this really about greedy doctors wanting medical centres and Terry White chemist warehouse CEOs on a paltry $1.7 million a year, wanting Woolworths $8 million or Qantas $25 million a year? Government created duopolies to give us cheaper prices. Minister, pharmaceuticals won't help us when we die laughing.
There was a question in there somewhere, but order. The Minister for Health and Aged Care has the call.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. I don't agree with a number of the assertions in it. This measure will go nowhere near to halving pharmacy income. Pharmacists, on their own data, as an industry, will earn about $100 billion over the next 4 years, assuming no growth. They got 30% growth over the last 4. These measures, depending on which modelling you accept, the industries, the guilds, or the governments, are somewhere in the vicinity of 1–1.5% of that revenue. Again, assuming no growth. We make no apology for recognising we've got more to do to deliver cheaper medicines. We've made huge inroads into making medicines cheaper at a time of unprecedented global inflation that's hitting Australian households as it is households right around the world. That's why we accepted the advice that had been on the books for 5 years from the advisory committee that oversees pharmaceuticals, 5 years, to allow people who are often on these medicines for decades, not just years, to be able to get 60 days' supply, something that will be of particular benefit to patients in rural communities that often travel vast distances to get to their pharmacies. And I don't accept that this is something only sought by doctors' groups, although this will have the benefit to the entire health system of freeing up millions and millions of GP consults that are currently used just for routine repeat scripts, instead for GPs to be able to use for much more complex health conditions. That's why you're right. All doctors' groups have supported this, but so has pretty much every single patient group that you can think about. The Breast Cancer Network of Australia, the Heart Foundation, Asthma Australia, Diabetes Australia, the Lung Foundation, groups like Council on the Ageing, the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, and I could go on and on. But of particular interest to the member for Kennedy, Mr Speaker, will be the endorsement from rural health groups, particularly the National Rural Health Alliance that represents dozens of health groups working in rural Australia. Now, I agree with the member for Kennedy. It is critically important not just to maintain a vibrant community pharmacy sector, whether it's operated under a franchise like Chemist Warehouse or Terry White, or whether it's a fully independent, and that is particularly important for small rural pharmacies. As I said in response to my question from the member for Mayo, that is a particular focus of the reinvestment plan that we have. We are talking to members, to other groups in the pharmacy sector about the particular needs of rural pharmacies that might be relatively close to the cities in Modified Monash Area 3 and 4, or areas like the member for Kennedy's, which would be Area 7. And we'll have more to say about that in due course.
Order. Give the call to the member for Paterson.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. Minister, what is the labour hire loophole that the Albanese Labor government is acting to close?
Call to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations and the Minister for the Arts.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Paterson, who's been making speeches about this issue for a very long time. When people ask about what's same job, same pay about, the best way to explain it is we're trying to close a labour hire loophole. It's not, as was depicted in some ads I saw last week, where there was this concept that somehow some employers might have to pay somebody who's been there for 6 years the same as someone who's been there for 6 months. That's something that is not government policy, that the government's not legislating, that I'd never thought about before, and now that I've thought about it and seen the ads, it's a really bad idea. But there is a loophole that needs to be closed. There is a loophole that needs to be closed, and it's this. When an employer has agreed, when you have an enterprise agreement in place and they've agreed this is the rate of pay that is appropriate for each classification, the employer should not then be able to use a labour hire company to undercut that rate of pay. And when people say, oh, what does this mean for productivity? Well, the employer has already agreed in the enterprise agreement that that's the productivity value of the work. And having agreed to that, then wanting to go off and use a labour hire company to undercut what they had already agreed was the value of that work. Now, that loophole needs to be closed. Senator Cash said in an interview last week, show me where the loophole is and then close it. Well, that's where the loophole is. Most employers aren't on enterprise agreements. Those who are on enterprise agreements, most employers aren't using this loophole. This is not something that ricochets in a massive way across every wages budget across the economy. But for those employers who are using it, it results in a radical cut in the pay for people who work there and creates a situation where you have people working side by side who've been there for the same length of time, who are doing the exact same job, often in the same uniform, working to the same supervisor, but are being put on different rates of pay. Why? Because there is a loophole that says, well, technically you're employed by someone else, so we can now ignore everything that had been agreed to. There are a series of loopholes that undercut wages. There's the fact that if a worker steals from the employer, it's a crime, but if the employer steals from the worker, it's not. That loophole needs to be closed, and wage theft needs to be made unlawful. It's a loophole that you can be working for a shop, riding your bike, delivering, and you've got the protection of the award system and all minimum rates of pay. But if you have the same lack of power, but you're working on a gig platform at the moment, you have no right to minimum standards at all. That's a loophole, and it needs to be closed.
The minister's time has concluded. I call the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I ask further questions be placed on the notice paper.